Welcome back to the channel. This is Roberto with Full Curl Precision again. Hey, we're in the process of moving, so things are happening. But anyway, for tonight's video, we're busting a little myth. That's the myth of as good as. Well, hey, this cartridge is almost as good as, therefore this also cartridge is almost as good as, and before you know it, you end up with a 22 long rifle that's equal to a 300 Win Mag, because almost as good as. But really, here's a more realistic comparison. The 308 is as good as the 30-06. But is it? Well, let's throw some numbers. So for one, you know how I like to try to do things. I try to keep it as fair as they possibly can. So for one, we're sticking with a 24-inch barrel, and we're gonna be running a 165 grain Sierra TGK, so tipped Game King. They're really good bullets. Both 308 and 30-06 are pretty commonly loaded with them. So I'm not going ridiculous with a ultra heavy bullet and kneecapping the 308. I'm keeping it into a balance, right? And then we're going to have some powders that are going to be pretty similar, but not exact. So for the 308, I'm going to go with N540. And for the 30-06, I'm going with N550. Yeah. So we're going to start with some numbers off the 30-06, and then we're going to switch over to 308, and then we're going to put those numbers into the ballistics calculator so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Now, again, I'm not dogging on anybody in terms of what they like, what they don't like. You know, if you're hunting within reasonable ranges, there's not exactly a significant change in there. But what we're talking about is when it comes to actual numbers, is the 308 as good as the 30-06? Well, let's look at the data. So, starting off with the 30-06, here it is, 24-inch barrel. I'm leaving it at the factory lengths, and I'm not modifying it anyway. Using a 165 grain Sierra TGK, and I'm using the Vitavori N550. Now, one other thing I needed to mention, let me actually push this up a little bit. We're pushing both of these to 62,000 PSI, and we're giving them a little bit of loving, all right? So you can push these a little bit more. So we're going to do that because 62,000 PSI is actually not uncommon anymore with these cartridges. So we're going to push that to 58. We're going to take that to 58.5. There we go. So we won't go too crazy. So with a pressure of just over 60,000 PSI with 58.5 grains of N550, pushing that 165 grain Sierra TGK, look at this number right here, folks. 2961. So I'm rounding it up because it says 2960.9. So it's close enough. We're going to say 2961 feet per second and over 3,200 foot-pounds. But here's where it gets really nice, because this is what you're always looking for. A 100% burnt propellant and a load ratio of 98.5. So you're almost at capacity. Now, you're not going to really be at, you don't want to fill capacity too much because you don't want to go over pressure. But at the same time, that's a really good load ratio. So you're getting almost 100% fill and a 100% burnt propellant. That's actually a really good solid number. 2961 is no slouch. So if we take that, and I take that into the ballistics calculator, as it pulls up, here we go. Come on, all the way. So we're going to put, hand loaded. And we're going to put in muzzle velocity of 2961. Let me go back and I have to check the BC on that bullet. We're looking at a .530. So 2961 0.530. And we're having all the other aspects the same, except we're going to change this up. I'm going to go to a max of 500 yards, increments of 100. So when we pull that up, what that ends up looking like with a 200-yard zero, you're still maintaining just under 2,700 feet per second, 2668, and over 3,000, just over 3,000 foot-pounds of energy, and only 2 inches of drift. That's really good. At 400 yards, you're only looking at 17.5 inches of drop, 8 inches of drift, 2,394 feet per second. So still just under 2,400 feet per second. That's moving along over 2,400 foot-pounds. And at 500 yards, 35.1 inches of drop, 12.9 inches of drift, 2,263 feet per second, and 2,160 foot-pounds. So it's actually a pretty solid trajectory because you're moving that bullet along quite well, being that you're moving it at 2,961. So you're approaching the 3,000 feet per second mark with a 165 grain bullet. That's quite solid. That's a solid trajectory. That's really good. You'll take just about anything with that. So if we go back, and now we're going to select in GRT, we're going to scroll down to the 308 Winchester. All right. So using the same bullet, we're going to push that again to 62,000. And we're going to change that powder. First off, drop down to 4. There you go. So it's in the chart. And we're going to change that powder to the Vihtavuori N540. And when we do this, you can already see we're kind of pushing it a little bit, so we're going to have to peel it back a little. 45 grains, just a little much. So 44.5. So, again, it's not the best, but that's not terrible either. So at 44.5 grains of the N540 with a 165 grain bullet, you got 2,762 feet per second and 2,795 foot-pounds. So if we take that, and again, we're going to just swap out. Here we go, and we do this, and we're going to go 27. Hold on, let me pull that back up so I know exactly what I'm doing. 2762. Because it's the same bullet, therefore I don't have to change any BCs or anything else. We can see there's quite a bit of difference. So at 200 yards, not enough of a difference to matter. You're talking about only 2 inches, 2.1 inches of drift, 2,482 feet per second instead of 2,668. So you're talking like 180 feet per second difference. Yeah, that's a pretty good jump. And then you go out further. With the 30-06, you had 17.1 inches of drop, 20.7, and 8.9 inches of drift. Much slower, 2219, and 2076 foot-pounds. And here's where you're starting to see the big difference. So the 30-06 only had 35 inches of drop. This is at 41. It's a 6-inch difference. Now, I get it. You can dial, so on and so forth. But the thing is, as a natural trajectory, that's quite a bit. And you had 12 inches of drift, but now you have 14 inches of drift. So it's actually quite a gap in terms of the amount of inches of drift. If you're within an inch, not a big deal. But you're over 2, so it is a big deal. And 20.93. So, again, while I'm here, same bullet. So we're going to remember this number. we're going to look at the 500-yard mark. So you got 41.3 inches of drop, 14.3 inches of drift, 2093 feet per second, and 1848 foot-pounds. We change that back to the 2961 that was there. Hit enter. Again, 35.1 inches. So you're talking like 6 inches of difference. Yeah, and so you have less drift. And look at that. You're just about 200 feet per second faster at 500 yards than the 308 is. And instead of like 1,800 foot-pounds, you're at 2,160. So, do any of those numbers there that you're seeing, are they just as good as? No, they're not. They're not just as good as. It's not that those are bad numbers for the 308. It's just that when you say something's going to be just as good as, it implies that there's a much tighter tolerance, a much tighter consistency between the two casings, and that's not it. Those gaps will only open up more and more and more the further you go. So I'm going to tell you right now, though, if I'm going to take this on more than just a whitetail or a mule deer or a pronghorn, and I said I was going to go for elk, I'm taking the 30-06. It doesn't make sense to me to take the 308. Not when you get less drift, better velocities, and more energies, and a flatter trajectory with the 30-06 than you do the 308 with the exact same bullet. So, is the thing of just as good really true? No, not in this case. Now, here's the thing. There are caveats. If you have a case that happens to have a bullet that's similar to another one, and they have similar wound channels, you might be able to argue just as good. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be identical, but if you load a hot 270, with a 150 grain bullet, and then you happen to have a slightly mediocre round with a 150 grain bullet out of a 7 Rem mag or a 280 Remington or whatever the case is. If you take the 270 and the 280 Remington, and you have identical weight in bullets, they're driving them close to the same speeds. They're driving them with the same kind of everything else. That could be a case where you're talking just as good as, because you're talking the identical weights and virtually identical powder reservoirs. Everything on those is real close. That's one thing. But if you're talking about there's drastic differences in what a cartridge can offer, then no, you're not going to be just as good as. It doesn't exist. So I'm going to say this is a myth, and it's not, definitely not a just as good as situation. Not when you're talking 308 versus 30-06. So that's all I have for tonight. Please like, subscribe, share, comment, and we'll talk to you again.